Hello, welcome along to Live on Air this evening. I'm David Bell. I'm a retired Methodist clergy and I help to run the e-learning centre here at Trinity-at-Waiake, and with me is John Murray, and I'll get John to briefly introduce himself and his current roles.
Thank you, David. I've retired from Presbyteral ministry. I have served in parishes and in connectional appointments, and with David and other colleagues enjoyed our companionship at conference. And I think, David, sitting in this church does remind me of one of the very early learning projects the mission resourcing engaged in with the support of this parish in providing resources to the whole church, which was a very exciting moment. And this is a movement from that, if you like, and it's good news.
Wow, that's actually drawing on quite a memory, John, because that must have been back, what, in the very early 2000s or late?
It would be about 1997, 98.
Wow, that's even further back than that. Yeah. But I can remember that we had a generous donation from, you were then Director of Mission Resourcing, right. Yeah. And the parish here had a generous donation to help it produce CDs, and that was one of our first multimedia adventures. So we have come a long way in from 1997 to 2017. That's a considerable number of years, and John has had a vast experience thinking about what it is to be a Methodist and how do groups of Methodists that organise themselves into congregations or study groups or bigger units like parishes, how they actually carry out their mission and kind of get going. So, John, in your opinion, just at present, do you think that the Methodist Church is making more progress in terms of how it thinks about mission?
Well, I think one of the traps the Methodist Church has fallen into is the trap of mission as an institutional activity. And I recall some words of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who said that the church that is dying does mission. So the only time you think about mission is when it's all going pear-shaped on you. His thrust, and the one that I always wanted to cultivate, is the one that the church is mission. The congregation is mission. The individual is mission. We can't escape that. And I find that liberating. And the church at the moment, I think, is really stuck in hope that somehow the elixir of life, or the elixir called mission, will come along and it will all be great again.
I think that's a really interesting idea, that the congregation is the mission, as opposed to, are we a congregation with a mission? That's certainly something that could be teased out a little further on. There are dozens and dozens of initiatives that congregations can involve themselves with, but they don't get to the heart of what you've just said. And the heart of it seems to be the congregation is, rather than just the mission of God, it's the hermeneutic of the gospel.
Absolutely.
If we want to know what the gospel is amongst a group of people, we look at the congregation. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think if we could do that, I think that's quite a liberating moment, because it enables the congregation to, if you like, connect within itself, but actually connect within the community rather than adopting a posture of pure evangelization. Connects with the community and approaches the whole idea of life and mission in what I would call the community development model, which is that all the essential tools are there.
Those tools are in the hands of the people already. Yeah. They may need some external assistance to learn how to use the tools or to get some financial resource or
absolutely.
But everything that is necessary, I think John and I are totally agreed on, is there already. And getting outside, I mean, for a long time back, I was a synod superintendent or district superintendent, and people would and congregations would sometimes look to the synod for answers, as if that group of people could provide the mission to this group of people. And I'm not convinced by that as a model.
The moment you adopt that model, I think you're looking for someone to blame when it all goes wrong. I think what we need to do, and maybe the place of the synod, is to gather, or to be the gathering place for those congregations, so that they can provide the inspiration, and in the great sense of Methodism, from within that, the leadership is there.
Yeah, and leadership may be extremely varied. There's no one
absolutely.
way that leaders...
No, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, the Reverend Uesifili Unasa has also joined us in the meeting. And Uesifili, would you like to very briefly say a little bit about the roles that you've had in Methodism? Because we're engaged in this discussion about what the connection and its mission is all about. So what have you been up to?
Well, I've had a few parish appointments starting from Dargaville and South Auckland and Mangere Tahuhu, then Dunedin, and then out of Methodist Connection to university, and then back to the Methodist Church in St. Paul's, Remuera, and out again in hospital chaplaincy over the North Shore. So there's been a bit of a mixed bag, but I think quite a good spread of understanding how Methodism works across the country.
I think a really marvellous understanding, Uesifili, because you've traversed not only geographical things around the country, you've also traversed cultural diversity and have worked at helping different cultural groups understand what the gospel is about in different cultural contexts. And that's been a very consistent theme for you. I can remember when you first went to Dargaville, you sent me a sermon on the Treaty of Waitangi, and I said, well, I'm sorry, the Methodist Theological Review doesn't publish sermons. I said, it's a great sermon, but we don't publish them. And now I spend most of my life trying to publish sermons. So it just shows the kind of way in which we have all become part and parcel of this thing called Methodism, and how hard it is to give it up despite the stresses and strains that it goes through. Now, John has indicated that he thinks that the heart of a congregation or a group in the Methodist Church is that the congregation is the mission itself. And have you got any comment about that?
Well, I come from a background generally of being a Samoan Methodist, which again gives a different perspective, is that it's not about mission, it's about being Methodist. And it might just happen to include mission in it. It's about an identity that you belong to a family that's called Methodist and Methodism. Now, I think what has happened over the years is that the merging to a New Zealand context has really emphasized that kind of mission-oriented kind of Methodism. But when you look at my particular brand of Samoan Methodism, it's very much inward-looking and in some way very congregational. So there's been a clear challenge in terms of the New Zealand context for my particular kind of Methodism, to be a bit more outward-looking and to be a bit more contextual in terms of a global view of mission. My other sense is that as we become more diverse, I think, in our Methodist Church in New Zealand, I think we have become more inward-looking in terms of our Pacific Methodism, and particularly issues around the gay and sexuality issues, that has made it even more inward-looking and perhaps protectionist in terms of upholding traditional views rather than opening up a kind of a dialogue. So that's the kind of, I guess, definitive congregational understanding of Methodism. But I have a feeling there's probably an understanding of what global Methodism might look like from a Pacific perspective.
Well, I think Uesifili makes a really interesting point, and it's one I think we avoid facing up to, and that is when we talk about mission and ministry within even the Methodist Church of New Zealand, that means different things to different groups. And sometimes they do that by choice because it saves engaging in the dialogue. It saves confronting the issues of what it means to be Methodist in New Zealand. And it was one point Uesifili makes, and it's an interesting one, as he interpreted my statement about mission. I would want to say that what mission is about is the local community and the congregation, yes, but it's also about being Methodist. And it's a way of life. It's a way of being. And I think that in my experience, not so much with the Samoan communities, but with the Tongan communities, was when it came to people candidating for ministry, they were candidating from family to then provide a ministry back to family that gave status, that gave power, but also did something else that is both good and bad, preserved a understanding of Methodist orthodoxy that actually I believe was, and this is a real trap. I think what Uesifili is alluding to is that trap that is there, which is denying the cultural groups and the wider church from the possible richness of a different model of ministry, different understanding of mission.
Methodism to me is not so much a way of life or a way to be, but rather, as someone in the viewing audience has suggested in the chat pod, it provides a series of constraints. Methodism is a constraint. Now, it can be very helpful to have certain constraints as a Christian, and sometimes it can be, the devil can be in the detail. And so empowerment through being constrained in some ways is a pretty difficult kind of balance to achieve. But it reminds me of what happens in terms of good design. If you're designing a book cover, if you're designing a table, if you're designing a house or designing a painting, you are limited. You have constraints that force you to think inside the box. There may be some amazing things that you can do within the box, but those constraints are there, and usually those are the constraints of the very things that you guys have mentioned. What is family? Because family can be a constraining force that liberates, or it can be a constraining force that pulls inward. Another is financial constraint. I think of congregations that have closed up and down New Zealand. We've all been involved with it. And I think of other congregations that have opened up. Some have become very wealthy. Some have become trapped by buildings and become very poor. All of these things are going on, and they lead me to suspect that the constraints we work with are not the real constraints of the gospel. The constraints of the gospel would actually liberate us, that would enable us to fill up the whole canvas so there weren't borders around it. But if we have those other constraints, finance, resource constraints, family constraints, we end up with just a series of square boxes on the bigger canvas. Any comments about that from either of you?
Well, yes, I think you put it quite well, David. My sense is that out of those constraints comes the isolation that people put themselves through primarily to avoid some of the constraints that you're talking about. And I think a lot of that is happening around congregations where they are isolated away from the connection, even at synod level, because of the constraints or even the perception of the many constraints that make up Methodism. So I think out of those parameters that appear to be the constraints or the checks and balances, have become isolating factors in which people actually want to do their own thing.
What is the church doing to replenish leadership? Now, I don't mean what's the national church doing or what's the synod doing. I don't even mean what are the parishes doing, but at the unit of the congregation, at the unit of the study group. Where do we get a sense that people are saying, hey, we need to replenish our leadership. We need to find some fresh directions that will enable people to come on board with what we're on about.
In the parish that I was in, no one talks about candidation for ministry. I think they talk about the shortcomings and the failing of pastoral ministry and the failings of connectional leadership. So it isn't an inspirational model, if that's what we're looking for. And it certainly doesn't inspire people at the local level to talk about these are the kind of people we want to be at the local level, and I want to go into training at Trinity College, or I want to take up a synod role, or even a connectional role. There doesn't seem to be that kind of role modelling that inspires people at the local level. And that's happened now for a few years in terms of my more recent ministries. People often talk about the loss of spark. I don't know what that means, but it's a loss of spark to be connected or to be inspired or to be passionate.
The church didn't have any definition of leadership in its candidating procedures. It was fascinating watching for a number of years. The criteria for candidating did not and was not allowed to mention leadership because leadership was anathema. And the reason why it was that was that there was a view that everyone was a leader. Now, I totally agree with that. However, you have to have a healthy understanding of leadership to recognise that not at all times and in all places can all people be leaders. You have to be able to recognise, if you like, the charisma in people at a particular time. Different people will lead in different places and in different ways and provide different resources. And one of the failings of the Methodist Church, I think, was the arrogance of church leadership when it said, in actual fact, through the stationing process, we shall address the very issues Uesifili raised of congregational isolationism by changing presbyters regularly and just telling the parish, this is the person who's stationed here. And they would do this about every 3 years just to make sure parishes were contained and controlled in a way that complied with the norms that had been set by some unknown group within the church. Missed the point completely. And I think to this day people have resented the type of leadership that in actual fact operating at its best is inspirational, and that is good circuit leadership, as I would call it, which is one of being the theological, Eucharistic leader who enables all sorts of other people to take responsibility, take leadership, do things, and most importantly, take some risks.
Yeah, next week I'm interviewing Clive Dyson, who I trained with. I think he came a little bit after you, John.
I knew Clive, and hiya, Clive. we shared in some good moments together during his candidating time.
Well, one of the things we'll be talking about is now he's retired and does arts and crafts in terms of, making things for kids and beyond, and raises money. It's a great sense of mission that Clive has through Christmas gifts, to enable children that otherwise wouldn't have gifts. They have something. And we talked about that, a year or so back, and it stuck with me ever since. That actually everything that a church member does can be done with that same sense of excitement of mission and purpose. And you need local people. Those are leadership roles in their own right, and they are the kinds of leadership things that are inspirational to others. Now, I mean, I know that TV does this. It's got a TV One has its good sorts, and there are all kinds of ways in which community radio, etc., assists the promotion of those kinds of ministries or outreaches. But I don't get a sense that congregations as a whole understand this centrifugal and centripetal force, the inward and the outward. Which is it to be? And how the gospel, by both constraining, can also give rise to the liberation. Rosalie Segru makes the point that her mother said, well, look, in a Christian community, in a church, everyone has an opportunity to do some sort of service. But I can't see our connectional structures, the way in which we can get candidates for ministry, the way in which we try to get some people to become lay preachers, none of these things seem to be working in such a way that they're inspirational to anyone. And yet inspirational work is being done. And so I'm really worried by what I see as the lack of oxygen to make things happen anymore. Does that worry either of you? Or am I misreading the church? Is the church a much happier place than I think it is?
Well, I must say, when I went to the last conference held at Wesley College, I hadn't been for a few years. I must say, I was trying to recall the first few conferences I went to, and even though I was stuck out in Bargable, I was actually quite inspired by the people coming to conference and talking about what drove them and listening to their stories. And actually, I was quite passionate about what was happening in the Methodist conference. That was at the beginning of my ministry in the mid-90s. Going back last year, I have to say it was the most boring, de-energizing, and actually quite a depressing experience. Now, I think the only sort of thread of connection I had to the conference was the fact that I kind of knew what was going on in the business session, which wasn't much. But apart from knowing a little bit about how it all works, there was nothing there that said to me, this is what makes you a Methodist, and this is what inspires you to do the Methodist thing in a wider context outside of the Methodist Church.
And so conference itself used to lose the plot. And I really found that almost pathetic in a tragic way, that conference had given itself some tasks that rather than empowering it to resource and enable ministry, had actually disempowered it. And you could watch people in their participation levels, just even in the week of conference, disengage more, disengage even more. Now that's not really that clever. Then a couple of years later, we did a presentation as the new mission resourcing, which was the Board of Ministry, and we had about 180 people went to that committee of detail, which was quite ridiculous. And we actually gave people projects. We said to them, talk in groups about some of the things you are doing. Because it seemed to me, when you go to conference, it simply receives a report about what we've done. You've not really asked people, what are we going to do next? And what are the resources we can share across congregations without interference from us connectional leaders to tell you what to do? And they have some brilliant ideas, and to this day I've begged, borrowed and stolen them. And I think conference has tried to be a consultative, consensus, power-sharing, decision-making body without actually changing. You can't do that. You've got to have a willingness to shift completely and say, okay, we have to do things differently. David, you gave the illustration of talking about making a table. Well, if you tell people, yes, we're going to make a table, well, guess what? We'll make a table. There are only so many ways you can do that. But if you say to people, well, actually, can we do things differently without a table? And see what people come up with. I think people have the energy to be inspiring at that point. The role of leadership then is to pull that together so there's a coherency around it, and then let it happen.
One of the things that really interested me, because now that I'm retired, one of the joys is that I don't have to attend synod, and I don't have to attend conference, and the not having to attend conference is actually a very big liberation. But that's not to say that I don't find some aspects of it intensely interesting, particularly when it can't make its mind up about who it's going to choose to be the president. And this has been an ongoing problem since they introduced a new model of doing away with the old-style Westminster, let's have a vote and the person that gets the most will become the leader, and likewise for the vice president. Now we've seen decade after decade of really strange decisions made, and the last conference highlighted probably, in my opinion, what was the worst thing, when they actually abandoned the process of selection. And I'm still not convinced that they had done that entirely within the law. And I've looked at a number of little bits of legal advice. I've spoken to one solicitor that's lawyer that's very prominent within church life. And the idea that you can sort of keep changing the process, we're going to build the aeroplane while we're flying it sort of thing, that doesn't give rise to constructive leadership. What we need, I'm looking for a president that will say, here's my vision for the church. This is the theology I want to do. This is the outreach that I want to do. This is the pastoral care that I want to do. But instead we just get kind of, I'm interested in pastoral care and I'm interested in theology, etc. There's no spark, Uesifili. That's the word you use. And I wonder whether the spark has been driven out by the lack of care and attention to the constraints.
There's an old saying in politics that you get the government you deserve. And in some way, our processes and our decision-making gives us the presidency we deserve. And I don't know if the quality of our leadership is as good as it can be, given what I think is a process-determined style of leadership. And it's not so much about the ability of the mavericks and the theologians and the personalities that come through. It's the constraints of a process which, to me, has thrown out the kind of presidency leadership that one I have found quite bewildering in terms of the kind of issues that we have facing the church. And the fact that we are lacking in inspiration and lacking in any clarity moving forward as a church is part and parcel of what is not allowed to happen rather than what should be happening for the church. And to me, the processes reflect how tightly controlled a lot of what we do now takes place in conference. And I'm not sure if that's bringing out the very best leadership that I think we really do need right now in terms of our Methodist church.
One of the interesting lessons I've had working with government agencies and business people who do their jobs very well, before you introduce any process, you actually test it, or they would call it modelling it. You try it out through a series of scenarios and artificial situations, and you test it almost to destruction. And you note all the things that can go wrong, and if there are too many of them, you say, well, actually, the process is no good. Don't use it. Stick with the old process, even if it's bad. And I think at this selection last year, the process didn't work. So what is the fall position? I believe the fall position is already enshrined in the Methodist process, and that is under the consensus-making model of decision-making. When you don't get to a consensus, the status quo remains. The status quo would have been the incumbents carry on. Now that might have forced the issue for us as a church to say, we can't let this happen again, we've got to get it sorted out. No, what we do is we introduce a reactive system. Reactive systems very rarely work.
Well, I think I've seen enough in the law to suggest that what we've got at present is a totally unworkable system, and no matter who is now selected, we will simply have to ask the question, well, are you the person that was in reality selected in 2016, or are you the person that in reality was selected in 2017, because we've got multiple things occurring? We've had some really interesting viewer feedback, and I'm going to pick up a point from both Clive and Stuart, that they're not really interested in what goes on at the Methodist Church or the Methodist Conference per se. They're supporters of the gospel. And it seems to me that one of the key things that's gone wrong in the last couple of decades in the life of the Methodist Church is that it has confused these great debates about who will be president and all of that kind of thing that go on in the conference, as if that they've confused it as if it were the gospel. And so lay people, and I think the majority of clergy, are not interested in that sort of argument anymore. And my sort of closing point would be, no one is going to worry in the least who becomes the next president or vice president of the Methodist Church of New Zealand, Te Hahi Weteriana Aotearoa. Or perhaps the only people that are interested are those that are standing for the position. But how they got there and all the shenanigans that have gone on behind the scenes hasn't helped them become effective church leaders. It hasn't helped the congregations to feel that they have effective church leaders. All it's done is constrain in a way that draws people inward rather than flinging them outward with the force of the gospel and enthusiasm. So that's my closing comment, and thank you very much for Clive and Stuart raising that with me. Any comments from the two of you to draw our meeting to a close?
Well, I don't even want to mention Methodism or anything else. I simply want to say that for a long time, if you like, my mantra has been to travel light, to travel together, and to travel enthusiastically.
Ah. Well, I like it, John.
I don't know if I can beat that, John, because that's very well said. But my hope for the Methodist Church is that it becomes less about protecting one's patch, whether that's a financial patch or a property patch or a theological patch or a cultural patch. But it's actually more courageous and has some guts, not just to critique what it's doing, but actually to say something in the wider arena of our society. I'm looking for that kind of Methodism because that's the one that inspired me, not just to be a Methodist in my whole life, but to actually commit to something more practical through ministry. And I hope we can rediscover some of that. I think it's to the detriment of our gospel and our identity as Methodists that we have become so timid and passive, not just in the world, but within our own selves, that we say nothing to anybody. And that's a shame if we continue to go down that track.
That's really well said. Well, I want to thank all our participants this evening and the two of you for coming live on air again. And we'll all meet again fairly soon because we hope to do one on the election coming up in New Zealand, either just before it takes place or just after. And that should be really fascinating, where we bring in Uesifili particularly to talk about the politics of it. Thank you both, and we'll see you all.